Ranji Khanna. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the director of the John F. Franklin Humanities Institute. I want to thank you very much for joining us this morning for the first in this semester series of TGI FHI, the Franklin Humanities Institute's Friday morning series, which gives Duke faculty in the humanities, interpretive social sciences, and the arts the opportunity to present on their current research to interlocutors in their fields and in related fields, and allows you, the audience, whether you're here in person with us or on Zoom, to get to know the humanities, arts, and interpretive social sciences faculty here. There's no agenda or theme indicated in the series, no demand to be disciplinary or interdisciplinary, just to present the work that faculty are doing that most excites them at this time. We're trying out a new format, so bear with us. It's one that brings our colleagues into our space for the kinds of intimate conversations to which we have become accustomed. And also we're aiming to take advantage of some of the lessons of last year, inviting participants from outside of Duke, both locally and from around the world, to participate virtually. And while I regret that we cannot have our breakfast provide you with the forms of hospitality to which I hope you have become accustomed in the past, I'm delighted that we're able to include in this format colleagues and interested publics from near and far, in addition to those who have access to Duke at this time. On the website of FHI, you can find recordings of past TGI FHIs, and if you want to go back and watch sounds again, you'll find that there. So this morning, I'm very pleased to introduce Sam Daly, who has added so much to the intellectual life of Duke since he arrived here in 2017. And I may say in this regard that I'm very happy that he sits on the faculty board at FHI. Sam's book, A History of the Republic of Biafra, Law, Crime, and the Nigerian Civil War, appeared last year from Cambridge University Press, and it gives us a detailed and conceptually dazzling history of the Republic of Biafra's brief existence from 1967 to 70, following the Nigerian Civil War. Essential claim, as I understand it, is that contrary to international discourse around Nigerians as lawless, in fact, the establishment of the law in Nigeria generally, but specifically in Biafra through the court system especially, was so important that in fact it was in many ways what held the state together. He writes, quote, "It is impossible to understand Nigeria's long experience of crime without the context of the Nigerian Civil War, specifically the survival tactics that Biafrans and Nigerians developed to cope with wartime dangers and post-war hardship." End quote. To explain this dyad of law and criminality, but not lawlessness, he brings analyses of court records, memoirs, in addition to interviews, to give us a broad social history of the processes of reconciliation, reconstruction, and rehabilitation. And he shows how jurists who created an idea of Biafra through courts, tribunals, and law and order edicts was lived in the lives of those coping with war and its aftermath. Besides giving us an understanding of how the huge presence of the force of law in many guises belies the possibility of thinking of Nigerians as lawless, he also asks us to interrogate such ideas as corruption, that are too often levied without distinction in conversations concerning third world states. And indeed asks us to tackle the correlation that is often given between the idea of corruption and a failed state. What comes across is a historiography that is deeply invested in understanding the revolutionary aspirations of the actors involved in creating an idea of the state, and indeed in creating mechanisms of survival. A place that we mostly know of through internationalist interventions, for example, the creation of Doctors Without Borders, human rights agencies, or indeed through some of the really wonderful novels that have come out, has been given a very particular form of historiography, the provides a model moving forward. This book was the winner of the 2021 Law and Society Association J. Willard Hurst Book Prize. Sam has published extensively and in many venues, besides the impressive record of scholarly journals in which he's published, for example, African Affairs, Journal of Imperial and Commonwealth History, Radical History Review, etc. It's a real delight to see his excellent writing also in venues like the Los Angeles Review of Books, where he recently wrote a wonderful review of David Diop's acclaimed At Night All Blood is Black. He's truly a careful scholar and a writer who can work apparently seamlessly in public writing and in scholarly. Sam's assistant professor in African American studies with affiliations in history and in international comparative studies. And his talk today is titled How Soldiers Think, Law and Dictatorship in Nigeria. So please join me in welcoming.
Thank you so much, Roger, for that extremely kind introduction. And I'm now going to prove you wrong by making a very uncareful presentation. I'll just take a moment to make sure everything's right.
Yeah, take your time. We're all learning these new hybrid formats, so whenever you're comfortable.
Does that look good? Okay, great. The National Museum of Nigeria is a disappointment in most respects. Dusty ethnographic displays fill most of the galleries, and it sits in a smoggy corner of Lagos Island, where the roar of traffic is never out of earshot. The museum's collection includes some of the famous vessels from Ivo, and a couple of the famous bronzes from Benin sit in a small gallery that's cooled by a window air conditioner. One wing displays some of Nigeria's 20th century modern masters, but it is usually closed and seldom visited. The most popular gallery by far is a dank little room that holds a black Mercedes-Benz limousine, which is riddled with bullet holes. This was the car that General Murtala Muhammad was traveling in when he was assassinated in a failed 1976 coup led by a rival military officer. Muhammad was a popular military dictator who came to be seen as a martyr after his death. And this gallery, which is technically called the Hall of Nigerian Government, feels like a shrine to him, even when it's full of visiting school children. The car is surrounded by portraits of Nigeria's military heads of state, and each picture is seemingly chosen to illustrate his personality. There is handsome Yakubu Gowon smiling beatifically. There is Muhammadu Buhari standing rigidly at attention. A blurry photograph of Sani Abacha looks more like a mugshot than an official portrait. Despite visiting this room many times, I'm not sure whether it's supposed to be an indictment of the military's role in Nigerian politics or a celebration of it. This, in effect, is Nigeria's political pantheon. A parade of men in uniform marching around a bloodstained status symbol. For most of the 40 years that followed independence from Britain in 1960, Nigeria was ruled by soldiers who tried to run Africa's most populous country like a vast open-air barracks. The story of how each military regime gave way to the next is a tale of intrigue and thwarted ambition and betrayal. And it's not generally my aim to tell you that story today, except to say that there were 8 military regimes between 1966 and 1999, and 2 brief experiments in civilian administration, both of which were annulled by soldiers. Once each military coup was finished, the soldiers who were still standing mopped up the blood and set about governing the country. Today, I'd like to talk to you about how they reasoned and what they believed. What were their ideologies and their administrative philosophies? What did they think about human nature, and how did they try to change it? The short answer is that soldiers conducted politics like they fought wars. They approached every political disagreement like a battle to be won or lost, and they were willing to do just about anything to make sure that they emerged victorious. They treated their political rivals as enemies, not just people with a different vision, but adversaries who had to be eliminated. The world of soldiers in Nigeria, as nearly everywhere, is a world of conformity and hierarchy. And officers often believe, whether in public or in private, that they have figured out human nature, that they know how people work. These are men, and occasionally women, who are in love with their own strength, and whose self-regard as patriots, and very often as the saviors of their nations, is drummed into them from the moment that they enlist. In Nigeria, these soldiers promised that they would make a bountiful, orderly world. And their revolution, as they called it, would bring a second, deeper, and more lasting freedom than the freedom that formal independence from Britain had brought. Soldiers promised to restore the dignity that colonialism had broken. And they promised to inoculate the nation so it would never succumb to foreign rule again. They would provide for the poor, which was the class that most of them came from. And they would allow the weak to become strong in a way that the British and their partners in the Nigerian bourgeoisie never had. Nigeria's many peoples would all march to a single cadence, their differences hidden underneath their uniforms. And these promises were seductive, including to civilians. And they remained seductive, even as military regimes broke them over and over again over the 40-year period I'm talking about. Of course, Nigeria is not alone in this history. Many African states in this period were ruled by their militaries. And although Nigeria's period of military administration is especially long and maybe especially bloody, it was by no means unusual on the continent. At first glance, Africa's soldier kings might seem like a kind of unthinking rabble. Young men with guns with no plans, only ideological in the barest sense. The outsiders who had dealings with them generally arrived at that conclusion. And to the extent that historians have paid attention to them at all, they have followed that. One can search in vain for an account of what these men thought. And this is not just a problem for Africa. Beyond Europe, few authoritarians of any kind are studied for their political philosophies. But of course, this isn't because they haven't left us something to work with. Not only do despots have ideologies, many of them publish them in convenient pocket size. And these include, of course, Mao Zedong's famous Red Book, the Green Book of Muammar Gaddafi, the Juche idea from North Korea, and the Runama from Turkmenistan. These books might be easily mocked with their folk platitudes and their watered-down pastiches of other philosophies, both the left and the right. They swing between the grandiose and the ridiculous, and if it wasn't for the violence that has been done in their name, many of them would almost be comic. But authoritarian ideologies, including and especially those from Africa, are worth taking seriously. Like their better-loved civilian counterparts, Africa's military leaders were grappling with the big questions of the 20th century. How should a state be? What is freedom? Who gets what and how much? In answering these questions, they didn't leave behind anything so convenient as a little book, but soldiers nonetheless had a design for their society. We can find it in their actions, their speeches, and this is especially important to me as a legal historian, in the laws that they made. So I promised you today to talk about law, but I'm actually not going to talk much about courts and decisions. Rather, I want to talk about the spirit of the law and the way that soldiers thought about the law and order mandate that they took for themselves when they seized power through coups. All of these soldiers equated freedom with self-control. And they argued that true freedom comes only from the mastery of one's own instincts. This is something that soldiers often think, and it's not counterintuitive in the martial habit of mind. They saw civilians as a chaotic rabble who needed to be tamed, which is a word that many of them actually used. They valued discipline as an end in itself, and they saw no reason why this principle, which structured their lives, might not serve as a political philosophy for everybody. They really believed, with the naive confidence of young men, that they could bend Nigerian society into a shape resembling themselves. If a woman selling produce in the marketplace could be made to act and think like a soldier, they argued, then she would become truly free. She would no longer be a slave to her own instincts, and she could self-actualize and return their love. If everyone did this, Nigeria would become a prosperous and orderly society. To be clear from the outset, they were wrong, and my description of this martial philosophy is by no means an endorsement of it. The idea that discipline is freedom, beloved of drill sergeants and self-help books for men, makes for a very illiberal kind of politics in real life. And the freedom of rigorously applied discipline feels like no freedom at all to most civilians. By and large, Nigerians did not want to live in this vast barracks that their leaders were constructing for them. Nigerian militarism was a chimera, born with two sets of DNA. The first was the military tradition of British colonialism. By the time of Nigeria's independence, this was by and large the culture of the post-World War II British military. A liberal kind of militarism that respected martial culture but didn't worship it. Its ideologues argued that the military should be a force of defense rather than conquest, which of course was ironic, given that just a couple of generations before, that's exactly what it had been. But that was a history that most Britons now disavow in the aftermath of the Second World War. The military was to be staid and conservative, and soldiers might be obsessed with honor. They were also aware of what made themselves different from civilian society. The military was not supposed to have political ambitions, and for the most part, in post-World War II Britain, I think it's fair to say that it didn't. The other set, and this martial culture was one of the main things that really influenced how these soldiers thought, because many of them were trained in Britain. The other set of DNA was the radical militarism of anti-colonial liberation. And this was a lineage that stretched from Mangaliso Sobukwe in South Africa to Frantz Fanon in Algeria. And this strand of thinking held that soldiers had a very important role in politics indeed. It was very different from the kind of British model of militarism. Now, Nigeria's soldier leaders did not agree with everything that these more radical thinkers wanted. They had no interest in communism, for one thing, and they took a pragmatic approach to their relationship with former colonial power, Britain, that would have scandalized their brothers in arms to the left. Nonetheless, the Nigerian military elite had more in common with their comrades in Mkonto Wesizwe, or the FLN, than one might expect. All of these men treated respect and dignity as political values. All of them promised to restore the wholeness of societies dismembered by the British. They promised to shore up institutions that had been weakened by colonialism, and to exorcise its spirit from the Nigerian body politic. And like the radicals who theorized the armed struggle against colonialism, Nigeria's soldiers believed that only they held the key to liberation. So Frantz Fanon looms large in this story, even though to the best of my knowledge, he only set foot in Nigeria once, and that was on a layover. Fanon was a psychiatrist and writer from Martinique who joined the anti-colonial struggle with the FLN. And this, incidentally, is Kehinde Wiley's portrait, Frantz Fanon, after Memling's portrait of the Man with the Letter, which I think I'm sharing both because it's very beautiful and because I think it captures some of the reverence that Fanon enjoys today. His books offered a formula for how to understand colonialism, how to defeat it, and then to clear the wreckage that was left behind. His theories of armed struggle were influential throughout the post-colonial world, and Nigerian soldiers read him with enthusiasm, if not always, I think, complete understanding. One of Nigeria's most influential post-colonial thinkers, Yusufu Bala Usman, told his biographer of an almost religious encounter with Fanon's work as a student in London. Finding a copy of Black Skin, White Masks forgotten on the train platform, Usman started reading idly, and he became so engrossed that he stood there overnight, unable to put down the book. As he read the book, his biographer wrote, a deep fury began to swell and swirl in his mind and soul. His British teachers and colonial officials had related to him and his father's class with a big lie. Now, intellectuals like Usman were not the only people in Nigeria who were entranced by Fanon. Soldiers were moved by him too. And after all, as Paul Gilroy reminds us, he was one of them. Fanon described a reality that soldiers recognized, and Nigeria's leaders found his ideas useful, both in understanding their world and also in licensing the decisions they made. One of his most prominent readers was the Nigerian judge Chukwudifo Oputa, a completely fascinating Nigerian Supreme Court judge who was both an influential apologist for militarism and also a critic of many individual military regimes. Here he is in about 1990, gesturing to something. Oputa cited Fanon often. For example, in one 1986 decision, Oputa used a letter that Fanon wrote on his deathbed to square the necessity of preventative detention with the military's larger talk of freedom. We are nothing on earth if we are not first of all slaves of the cause, he cited. Indefinite detention is, quote, a necessary evil in developing countries, Oputa argued. Being a slave to the cause of freedom sometimes means depriving others of their liberty. This is just one small illustrative example, but what Oputa and others like him took him from Fanon, and in some cases actually integrated into legal decisions and a legal record, was that militarized violence could be reparative or restorative. Now, those who know Fanon better than I, which is probably almost everyone listening to this call, will probably point out that this was not a very deep reading of Fanon, and I fully agree with that. I think it likely came as much from Jean-Paul Sartre's famous gloss on the wretched of the earth, which defends the use of violence in stronger terms than Fanon himself did. But nonetheless, I think that soldiers and their enabling judges like Oputa were not wrong to find some of these ideas in Fanon's work and those of others like him. Military rule was not a betrayal of some more radical independence that was supposed to happen, nor was it revanchism or counter-revolution. Soldiers did not sell out the anti-colonial revolution, they were that revolution, and virtually all of them saw themselves that way. I think our understanding of independent Africa is warped if we assume that the goal of independence was a world where the inherent militarism of colonialism had been liquidated. And independence only looks like a failure if we measure it against the standards of somebody like Fanon. By accepting the lament that the revolution of independence didn't work, we have allowed Fanon, the revolution's greatest loser, to borrow an admittedly mean-spirited epithet from Stephen Popkin, who once used it to describe Trotsky, to obscure what happened in the moment. So what did happen in the moment? What was militarism as a system of thought designed for living? Nigeria's soldier elite thought of themselves as a vanguard whose sacrifice, self-restraint, and adaptability would meaningfully liberate their country. Formal independence from Britain in 1960 hadn't been enough, and as they saw it, Nigeria was still under the sway of a decadent neo-colonial elite. This elite was entranced by Britain and out of touch with the rural masses, which of course was the class that most soldiers themselves came from. Soldiers saw themselves as rigid, but not sclerotic. They saw no contradiction in the notion that a disciplined leader might not also be dynamic and adaptable. And their model was the man on the spot of adventure movies and action stories, who could face any challenge that came his way with daring and ingenuity. More than one high-ranking general cited the influence of H. Rider Haggard on his thinking, to the eternal embarrassment of the Nigerian intelligentsia, if you can imagine. Was it strange that these men's views of politics and the state were shaped by boys' adventure books, and British ones at that? Maybe, but after all, many of them were only barely adults themselves. One prominent military governor was only 23 years old when he came to power. The idea of revolution is an adolescent fantasy, the artist Jenny Holzer tells us. Nigeria was a country in which virtually everyone was playing soldier. For those who weren't in the formal military, there were women's auxiliaries, uniformed service organizations, civil defense groups, and militias that could join. Mandatory service, national service was introduced in 1973, and it's still there today, although now there are lots of ways to get out of it. Militarism took up residence in every corner of Nigerian society from the 1960s onwards, and critics began to speak of the armed forces as a kind of cult. In order to do anything beyond getting by, you had to be part of it. Militarism filled the field of vision, as I think these two photographs, both from the famous Magnum Agency, nicely illustrate. Soldiers made a cliche of military life into a political philosophy. Discipline makes you free. Militaries argue that it is only through strict constraints in how to dress, move, speak, how to interact with others, that a space of genuine freedom opens up for the soldier. This freedom, which is a freedom from the tyranny of one's own instincts, not a freedom to do what one wishes, is worth more than all the petty choices that military life disallows. What to wear, who to talk to, when to wake up. Martial discipline allows the soldier to unshackle himself from doubt, fear, and egotism. This, he comes to see, is true freedom, and it can only be won by abjuring the vanities and petty liberties that pass for freedom in civilian society. What I have just described is the soldier's ideology. And my gendered language here is intentional. Militarism is a fundamentally androcentric view of the world, even if in certain types of military regimes, certain types of women, like patriotic mothers or dutiful wives, often have a high status in martial society, which includes them too. And of course, female soldiers are hardly unknown to history. The military in Nigeria touted the fact that it appointed women to positions of authority, including as ambassadors and judges. And this was true. They appointed more women than civilians had, and not just to minor ministerial positions, mostly for show. But these women, like everyone else who toiled downrank from the Supreme Military Council, knew who they answered to. As Amina Mama wrote, soldiers, quote, played a banal game of gender politics, through which the tentacles of militarism were extended, legitimized, and consolidated. Women were as likely to be partners in militarism as critics of it. Military ideology promises that sacrifice and self-control today will buy prosperity and liberty tomorrow. This is also a belief that emerges from the barracks. It's only by following the rules strictly that soldiers can get what they are owed eventually. Most modern militaries, including Nigeria's, offer a contract to enlisted men, and today women. An unfree and maybe dangerous period of your youth is rewarded with financial and personal freedoms later in life, those that are offered by a pension, for example, or assistance from the families, from the state starting a family. Even though Nigeria's soldier elite were career officers for whom military service was not just a stage of life, they put a lot of stock in this idea that discipline today earns freedoms that can be cashed in later. But of course, for civilians living under military rule, there was no freer tomorrow, that their good behavior and self-control followed. Militarism promised no pensions or medals for civilians, just bondage. Nonetheless, for 30 years, soldiers continued to believe and to convince a fair portion of the Nigerian public that military-style discipline could transform Nigerian society, despite evidence to the contrary. Each was convinced that the last regime just hadn't gone far enough. And each really believed that the same forces of discipline that had transformed him personally from an unruly boy to a sharp young soldier, which is a narrative that virtually all of them told about themselves, this could be scaled up into a national level politics. And each soldier who took power acted as if he had come up with this idea himself. Discipline was an ethos of perpetual self-improvement, which held that civilians had a civic duty to become better Nigerians, healthier, wealthier, and more productive with every passing year. It described how people should act in public. They shouldn't litter or pollute their environment, which was very important to soldiers, and they should call one another by their proper titles. So not only sergeant and lieutenant, but also pastor, prince, doctor, Mrs., engineer. Nigeria's titles are famously grandiose and only became more so during the period of military rule. Women should respect themselves by dressing modestly, and men should remain fit for the nation by not smoking or drinking to excess. Some of these rules were enshrined in decrees, others were unwritten, and the penalties for violating them were often corporal. Some of those penalties, like floggings, were injurious, but other punishments actually served the function of self-improvement. On-the-spot exercise was very often imposed for minor infractions, and it wasn't unusual to see soldiers standing over somebody doing push-ups, or talking too loudly, or dressing improperly. Of course, in practice, discipline meant whatever soldiers wanted it to mean. Soldiers saw chaos all around them, from official corruption to street crime, to the fact that people didn't queue to get on the bus. It was a disease that had to be eradicated from civilian life and politics. In Discipline, a sycophantic army poet wrote in the military's official poetry journal, which is the thing that existed, was, quote, "The monstrous beast with human flesh and blood, the poisonous venom in mankind's abode, the sickle cell in sickler's fragile veins." And the cure that soldiers offered for this was a harsh one. If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like an egg. And to soldiers, every political challenge looked like a war. The most famous of the military's wars was the War Against Indiscipline, or WAI, pronounced by the plaintiff Y. It is an illustration of what the ideology of militarism looked like in practice. Although it was only officially declared in 1984, the Y was emblematic of military rule as a whole. It was a distilled version of the disciplinary tonic that all military leaders prescribed to the Nigerian public. The Supreme Military Council was vague about the duration of this war, to say nothing of what it would mean to win it. And its front line consisted of civilian brigades, mostly volunteers, who had a broad mandate to force people to behave by whatever means they deemed necessary. And its propaganda and iconography was everywhere in the Nigerian 1980s, including, as you can see here, on postage stamps. The Y's official slogan was QQ, one by one, turn by turn, do not rush, let us bring a little order into our lives. And indeed, getting Nigerians to form queues at bus stops became the military's obsession. The custom then as now was to board buses not in a line, but in a rush of pushing. And the military found this unseemly efficient. To force people to queue, Y Brigade members were posted at major bus stops in Lagos around the clock. Armed with whips, they would beat anybody who tried to rush aboard. And more than anything, it is these whips that the Y has been remembered for. And I think they have become emblematic of how people remember military rule in general, at least those who remember it critically. The fact that most Y brigadiers were young made this especially shocking. Nigeria is a gerontocratic society, and it cannot be overstated how radical it was to give teenagers the right to beat their elders in public. Even so, the Y was pretty popular, at least among some segments of the Nigerian public. No more huddles at the bank counters, no more corpses left to rot in the street, one woman wrote after coming back to Nigeria from a stint abroad. Others found its methods disturbing. The journalist Adewale Maya Pierce, who was one of the most astute chroniclers of the Nigerian 1980s, recalled a scene from the Y that he wrote, quote, "will stay with me forever." On a busy street in Lagos, a man caused a small commotion by shouting. Suddenly, from somewhere in the crowd, a policeman appeared brandishing a whip. Without bothering to find out what had happened, he set about the man and whipped him until he lost consciousness. Perhaps they thought he had been shoplifting. Perhaps they just felt like flexing their muscles. Everyone who lived through the Y has a story like this. Some tell it approvingly, others with a sense of shame or regret. There was another war within the war on indiscipline called the War on Filth. And the War on Filth was theoretically a sanitation measure, which was designed to encourage city dwellers to behave in a more salubrious fashion. But in practice, it was really an assault on the urban poor. The hustle and din of Nigeria's cities was astounding, and soldiers, humble country bumpkins that most of them were, found these urban spaces dizzying. The rules of honor didn't apply there. Everyone wanted to cheat. Everything was for sale, and spectacles of abjection seemed to lurk down every alleyway. So this war, as the soldiers who declared it argued, was a way to restore the moral order of these cities. And thus, they treated places like the slums of Lagos, the thronged market towns of Onitsha and Umuahia, and the decaying maze-like center of Kano as if they were battlefields. And the civilians who lived there experienced military rule as a long, brutal occupation. So this ideology of discipline, I argue, gave cover for chaotic and unchanneled violence, which was precisely what the military had promised to prevent by taking the reins from civilians. This violence gushed out into Nigerian society from barracks and bases and washed over anyone who tried to stand in its way. Soldiers tried to break the country's bad habits through the only thing that all soldiers know, force, by literally beating those habits out of civilians. And to most soldiers, this kind of violence seemed reasonable. But to those who didn't share their vision of what an orderly society looked like, or their conviction that human behavior could be corrected, it was alien and cruel. So what does all of this have to do with law? I have claimed to be a legal historian, and yet I have barely talked about anything legal today. Soldiers believed that law could be adapted to this disciplinary purpose. As a military jurist succinctly put it in 1976, we are really free only when we are not free from the law. Besides force, the one thing that soldiers had at their disposal was the law, or at least so they thought. Military rulers saw judges as their deputies, and the respect that they showed them proceeded from the fact that they saw law, and especially criminal law, as a natural ally in the kind of government that they wanted to create. Some judges, indeed, shared their disciplinary vision and were willing to play their part in implementing it. The discipline we are looking for must be a discipline through law, another judge wrote. Not a discipline which forces the subordination of the individual to the state, as in fascism, or the human person to the race, as in Nazism, or the individual to the class, as in communism. Soldiers relied heavily on the apparatus of law enforcement to this end. And as law and order ideologues, as all of them were, they believed that the courts should be partners in the task of governance. It was also, of course, important to them that they appear to the outside world to have a basis in law, and a legitimate one at that. They worried about being recognized by other states diplomatically, given the fact that all of them came to power through coups. And for this reason, they sought the blessing of judges whenever they could. Yet, at the same time, law was also a nuisance. The rule of law was a limit on executive power, even if it was a weak one. And even seemingly pliant and friendly judges to the military, like Okuta, often proved to have minds of their own and made decisions that the military did not want them to make. Even so, soldiers still continued to have a lot of faith in law as a tool of social engineering. And I think this proceeds from the fact that many of them didn't really know very much about law. What soldiers seldom understood about legal systems is that they can cut both ways. Law can be both a shield or a weapon, sometimes both at once. And law almost always has this dual nature. Even in the most despotic regimes, it can serve as both an instrument of repression and a tool of critique. And sooner or later, all military rulers learned that law could be turned against them. Not all judges were enthusiastic about the disciplinary project that they were engaged in. And the legal system didn't prove to be very useful in making the world that soldiers envisioned. Moreover, many military regimes saw themselves as modernizers, and law sometimes seemed to go at odds, to be at odds with that impulse. Courts and judges, with their fusty British traditions and their absurd powdered wigs, seemed hidebound and atavistic to soldiers. Soldiers also found legal hierarchies baffling, threatening, not least because they ran counter to their own systems of rank. So if lawyers or judges undermined the military too often, soldiers often turned to the language of decolonization against them. Only martial law, they would argue, could achieve a meaningful freedom because it was unconstrained by the English common law model that had been foisted upon Africans at the end of empire. Military regimes, they promised, would cleanse their countries of European influences, starting with the ones that soldiers found most inconvenient, which very often were principles of the English common law. Thus, we find military strongmen deploying a rather radical sounding language of decolonization, especially when describing how they plan to reform law. Of course, decolonizing law can mean many different things. And the legal system that African states like Nigeria inherited at independence was not a single apparatus, but a kit with many different tools and moving parts that presidents and judges could keep and discard as they saw fit. Colonization, General Ibrahim Babangida proclaimed in a 1989 speech, traumatized our indigenous legal system. The fact that our indigenous concepts of justice were supplanted not only by foreign laws, but also by alien notions of justice is sad. Of course, what irked Babangida about the judiciary was not really that it was foreign or colonial. After all, the military that he revered was of colonial manufacture too. But rather, he disliked the judiciary because he learned that it could undermine. It may sound curious to hear language that is basically lifted from Ngugi Thiong'o in the mouth of a military dictator, but it shouldn't sound strange. Like Ngugi, Babangida and other soldiers like him saw themselves as engaged in a task of repair, to heal the body politic, to excise the cancer of colonialism, and to create a more meaningful freedom. This affinity between soldiers and radicals has been forgotten in the history of Africa since colonialism. Historians have an unfortunate tendency to write about either the monsters we abhor or the superheroes we admire, but seldom the people in between. Studying the monsters allows us to revel in malice or bloodshed, which we render respectable by asking, what went wrong with this person? Or appending tart judgments to our accounts of depravity and excess. And to be clear, I am implicating myself in that more than anyone. In African studies, the fixation on monsters and the decision to describe them that way is fundamentally a product of racism, although it also reflects, I think, an impulse to plumb the depths of historical evil that many historians feel. Cruelty is a natural source of narrative drama, and all but the most abstemious of us crave a good story to tell. In African history, a kind of post-colonial Gothic has become the dominant mode of storytelling. On the other hand, we also pay attention to those whom we admire. We uplift those whose politics align with our own in some way, plucking from historical obscurity those who had a way of being that we could recognize. The result of all this is that in 20th century Africa, we know the most about a handful of villains, Bokassa, Amin, Mobutu, and Charles Taylor among them, and a handful of idols, Nyerere, Senghor, Nkrumah, Mandela among them. Thus, we have a hero's acre and a rogues gallery, and not a lot in between. The heroes have their detractors and the villains their defenders, to be sure, but generally it is this good and evil view of African politics that continues to hold. It leaves out the middling figures, despots who were not as flashy as Mobutu, radicals who were less visionary than Nyerere, and intellectuals who had none of Senghor's panache or Ngugi's fervor. Pan-African intellectuals and civilian nationalists did not have a monopoly on thinking about the future in post-colonial Africa. And the workaday soldiers who ruled Nigeria and many states like it were the ones who actually determined the everyday life of most Africans. We should pay more attention to them, as unsavory as many of us find them. I want to conclude by talking about history books and the people who love them. Lawyers and soldiers both speak the language of history. Historical consciousness is embedded in law, of course, especially in common law systems like Nigeria, where precedent compels lawyers to think about the past constantly. Soldiers live in the past too, arguably more than other kinds of leaders. Cadets around the world still read about the Peloponnesian Wars when they study strategy. And generals today still reach for Clausewitz when they're facing modern operational threats. For historians like myself, soldiers are among our most voracious readers. And the few historical books that become legitimate bestsellers are almost invariably those about wars or armies. Military history is intertwined with power, and it captures the public imagination in a way that no other study of the past does. For all of these reasons, historians often end up accommodating militarism. This was a point that Alfred Watts made in the 1930s, and people like Priya Satya draw our attention to it today. Satya shows how British imperialists use history to justify colonial conquest and to soothe the public conscience about the violence that resided in that moment. And I argue that, like their colonial predecessors, Nigeria's soldiers read history if they read anything. And they too used historical reasoning to justify the disciplinary dogma that they preached. The history that soldiers liked best was history that venerated tradition, that celebrated heroism, and that rejected the corrupting influence of foreign ideas. One of their favorite historians was Yusufu Bala Usman, the young man who was so entranced by Fanon in the London train station. Usman grew up to be a historian at Ahmadu Bello University, where he wrote the most popular and most widely read historical works of his day. Usman gave soldiers ideas they could use. He described Nigeria's pre-colonial traditions as stories of wealth, honor, and strong, charismatic men who fought against feudalism. He gave them a language of revolution that they could use, and he gave them straw men that they could fight against, decadent colonial administrators, nefarious foreigners, and corrupt Nigerian civilians who had sold out independence to fatten their wallets. When he called checks and balances a, quote, inane notion of Anglo-Saxon liberalism, and when he argued that, quote, the elaborate machinery of the English judicial system is a ruse for foreign domination, soldiers realized that they had found a kindred spirit. Now, they definitely didn't follow Usman to the end of his argument. As soon as he started talking about Marxist revolution, they put down the book, even though they liked his black and white vision of the past and the revolutionary fervor that he exhibited in his writing. Nonetheless, Usman's account of the past shaped how his readers thought about the future. And without intending to, he and other historians like him gave soldiers a language for politics. To soldiers, the appeal of returning to a political and ethical world that had been destroyed by colonial conquest wasn't about finding an unfettered kind of freedom, individual, communal, or anything else. Rather, it was about restoring the constraints that they believed were necessary for a harmonious society, which colonialism had destroyed. Decolonization, they argued, was about rebuilding a lost world of traditional authority, one that was ascetic, masculine, and in many ways very unfree, except perhaps by their peculiar definition of freedom. Their complaint was not just that colonialism had humiliated Nigeria. To soldiers, the problem with colonialism was not that it had been too violent or too disciplinary, it was that it had not been disciplined enough. So their vision for decolonization, therefore, was one that embraced punishment. I'm going to end there, but thank you very much for listening. I look forward to your questions.
Are you ready?
Yes, I don't think is there,
Yeah.
is there
Yeah.
I don't know how to.
Yeah,
Should I stop sharing this?
you could stop sharing the screen unless you would like to refer to any images, of course. And why no, I shouldn't do that, obviously. So okay. Sorry about that. So just to our Zoom audience, just before we begin, let me just remind you that you can put your questions in the Q&A, and I will keep an eye on the Q&A and then repeat them for those of us who are in the room who won't necessarily be able to see them. Okay, so Jacka, why don't you go ahead and thank you so much, first of all, Sam, for that wonderful talk, and Jacka, when
thanks. Despite your claims that this would be unorganized, it was to the contrary, I believe. So thank you for that wonderful talk. And apologies if this is sort of an annoying historian question, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about working with the category of the soldier, because it seems a little bit unstable. You noted, of course, that Fanon had been a soldier, and so had Senghor, who was a prisoner of war in a German war camp. But we don't think of them as soldiers, even though they're important parts of the biographies. And of course, they were soldiers for the French military. right? So not the national post-colonial military, but I wonder, if you had sort of these intellectuals that were soldiers, and then you have, sort of the masses, which I think you're referring to when you talk about what soldiers think, like what distinguishes them? How do you invoke the category of soldier as sort of an analytical evidence? Thank you.
That's a great question. Thank you. The line between soldier and civilian is indeed blurrier than most of the men that I'm talking about would have seen it as. What is the difference between a freedom fighter and a soldier? It is largely a matter of perspective. And when a unrecognized military, like a militia or a freedom organization of one form or another, wins, it very often becomes a formal military, which shows the fact that that line is blurred, because in a lot of cases, the structure and composition of that force doesn't change. All that changes is the outside endorsement of it. So I think that's the first part of the answer to your question. And Nigeria is actually a really important place for studying that, because I haven't talked about it today, but this is the subject of my first book. During the Nigerian Civil War, the question of what constituted a real army and what did not was central to Nigerian politics. And the status of soldier became something that just about anybody could claim during that war. Now, to the men who I have been talking about, it was not so hard to tell. It was not blurry. It was very black and white. Either you were a soldier or you weren't. They were, civilians weren't. That said, even for them, there were all of these other statuses that were soldier-like, that they believed were part of this process of making Nigerian society more like the military in general. So I mentioned the National Youth Service Corps, which is a non-military service obligation that young Nigerians are still to this day required to do, which is uniformed and is all about physical fitness and requires people to go off into the countryside and do service projects or teach school or that kind of thing. But it's described and couched in very military terms. And it's called a corps, So even though there are lots of things in Nigeria that aren't formally part of the military that were nonetheless militaristic in their organization. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, Sam, it's nice to see you after so many years. Boy, it's really amazing. But this is a great opportunity to get back engaged in your work. And actually, I think I have a simple question and probably a clarification, but maybe not. And you'll forgive me because I'm thinking about this, of course, through my own kind of German lens, as always. But there's a kind of famous phrase in my world called "working towards the Führer," so working towards Hitler. And it describes a kind of an attempt to say, why did people do things and to push the agenda further forward? And it's a kind of a blurring of ideology, but nevertheless putting ideology there. And I thought that there was something that you were getting at there, but there's an interesting lack of the leader, of the Führer, right? So you've got kind of ideology without agency. And so I'm wondering if you could kind of talk about where is agency here? Because it is an ideology that pre-exists the coup, right? And so, or is that could be a dumb question, but I guess agency was really what I was looking for there.
No, that's great. The fact that soldiers all wear uniforms and minimize their appearance of individuality can make it seem like they're all the same. Of course, you take off that uniform, and each soldier is an individual person with his or her own individual thoughts and ideologies. And even though the structure of militaries tends to abnegate that particularity, that doesn't mean it's not still there. And today I've mostly been talking about military rule, as you say, as a kind of ideology without ideologues, and as if all these people more or less believe the same thing. If you scratch beneath the surface, and if you drill down deeper into what they wrote and said and believed, there were subtle but important differences among these military regimes, and some not so subtle differences. So, I mean, I mentioned Sani Abacha, the final military ruler who ruled in the 1990s, who basically totally departed from this ideology of discipline and turned instead to all-out kleptocratic, governance where state-sponsored murder was the main form of like problem solving. So that's an important, bracket, an important period, part of this period that is distinct from what I've been talking about. And even in the other military regimes that were less extreme, there were still differences, and there were still distinctions that I've papered over today. I think, though, it is fair, at least at this level of talking about the spirit of military regimes, to paper over some of those differences and to say that there was some core of thought that united them all. And the way that they understood themselves is important too. They understood themselves not as patriarchs, as civilian politicians tend to talk about themselves. They often describe themselves as dutiful elder brothers, the people who would do the work, get the job done without the need for recognition and without the need for sort of veneration by the rest of the national family. And they rejected a lot of the kind of trappings of prestige that civilians had wanted. Now, of course, they had their own forms of prestige and their own desire to big themselves up as individuals, but these were not cults of personality. They really saw themselves as all serving this larger ideological task of discipline. And they would have said that they themselves were just servants of that task. The question of whether that's their characterization of themselves has any truth or not is another one, but that's why I guess I de-emphasized a bit their agency and emphasized instead, at least today, the unity of their system of thought. But I'm not convinced that I should. So.
That's great. Thanks.
I think Gulpan and then Erica. Yeah, Gulpan, go ahead.
So thank you very much for philosophy. That was very interesting. I was struck by the fact that you explicitly attributed to these different military leaders an acceptance of this kind of very Rousseauian concept of freedom, which in particular licenses the identification of discipline with freedom, and that was kind of part of your organizing apparatus. So I just wanted to ask, in a way, a kind of simple question. I guess it gets complicated, which is, do you think they really believed in that notion of freedom and kind of formulated it like that? Or do you think that they were interested for more obvious mundane reasons in discipline and having it and selling it, and that they just used this language as a way to kind of sell the discipline? And then the sort of trailer is, whatever your answer to that question is, how do you think, in kind of dealing with figures like this, that we tell the difference between those two options? So I'm interested in which one you think is the right one, but I'm also interested in how we figure out which one to choose.
That's great. I'm not sure that I can answer your second part, but as to the first part, soldiers justified their system of thought by arguing that it was better and more valuable for politics because it was not a system of thought. By which I mean, these were not smart men, and they were actually very proud of that fact. They were proud of the fact that they didn't think very much, and that they acted and did so in a way that was kind of automatic and conditioned by their training. And so, it's actually a bit, it's a bit unfair to them to talk about how they thought at all, because if you had asked them in the moment, they would have said, we don't have a philosophy. We are just doing the work that has to be done. I think where they got the conception that discipline is freedom was barracks life. They were not reading Rousseau. They were actually reading Fanon and some other people like him, but they were, but for the most part, that discipline is freedom ideology was something that they got in their military training, which I should note was for the most part in Britain. There is a military training academy called Mons, which is located in Aldershot, which was a kind of low-level British military training institution that previously, before decolonization, had served trained signalers and cooks, and then after independence was remade as an institution to train officers from the former colonies. And from the 1950s through the 1970s, just about every year, moms turned out at least one future head of state, many of them from Nigeria, from all over the former British colonial War II. And I say that it came from their training because you can read the training materials that were used in Mons, at Mons, and they talk about this idea of discipline and freedom as freedom, which then comes up, pretty unchanged in their political philosophies when they come to power. But I don't know that I can answer the second part of your question.
Yeah, can I follow up briefly?
Yes,
So
go ahead.
that's interesting. In a way, that kind of makes sense. That sounds plausible as an account of them, the figures. But I wonder if the bit you emphasized in the reply about their kind of proud, unthinkingness actually suggests that one of these answers is better, namely, they didn't really believe it. It's just some words, and they found it useful. And what they were really just trying to do was to uphold and promote discipline. And any of the further questions, in a way, it didn't really matter, except insofar as it was useful.
Yeah, that does seem plausible, actually. At the end of the day, what mattered most to them was that the streets were clean, people were queuing, public life was quiet, and they were willing to be fairly flexible in how they achieved that. And all of this kind of war on discipline stuff that I've talked about today was one way of doing that. Another way was the Sani Abacha approach of complete, all-out assault on the public. So perhaps this wasn't as much an ideological conviction as I've described. I'm thinking this through as I'm saying. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Eric, we have a question from Erica, and then we've got a couple of very interesting ones from Michael Pritchard and Sarah Katz that I will go to after. So, yes, Erica.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I was interested in what you're saying about the gender politics of this system of thought, and the way you sketched it out as the androcentric view of the world, where nonetheless patriarchal mothers and dutiful wives had a high status within it, and women were as likely to be partners as critics. Seems to match other authoritarian and military regimes in history in different times and places. But I'm wondering if there was any kind of particular Nigerian manifestation of that gender politics in terms of a Nigerian way of constructing masculinity or femininity.
There was, and the person who describes it best is the person that I quoted, Amina Mama, who was she was a philosopher, or maybe a sociologist, turned international bureaucrat, who described very critically and very deftly the workings of the family under military rule and how women participated in it, particularly. And one of the things that she argued was that what made Nigerian militarism particular was the power that women had over their husbands' ears, by which she meant very few people could criticize soldiers in public. Maybe that could happen occasionally through courts, maybe occasionally through petition, but there were not a lot of venues for the Nigerian public to speak back to the military and to say you're doing something wrong. Amina Mama argued that the only people who had that power were their wives. And this was, I think, largely true. And so when military rule tended to change course, she argued, it was often because some powerful wife of a military officer had convinced her husband that this was the wrong way of doing things. I think there's probably some truth to that. And whether or not you see that as, a form of public power or not, kind of depends on where you draw the line in public. But that's I think one of the things that makes this, that makes Nigeria's experience of militarism maybe not unique, but just
It's very interesting. It strikes me that Grace Masuda has been doing some work on precisely this the university which waters around, and exactly the role of the powerful wife in the political life of a couple of different states in her regard. I think that the next couple of questions from Michaeline and Sarah are kind of related, and in some ways might take you into some of your earlier work as well, Sam, and in some ways a sort of, just to give my own kind of understanding of the questions and a context for them a little bit. You talked towards the end about sort of this idea of the colonial government, in a sense, not being disciplined enough, right? And going back to an earlier idea of what the space was. And as you've talked about before, of course, this is the case with all post-colonial nations, is that these are borders that are basically established through the period of colonialism, and then actively again at the moment of decolonization, and so actually bear no resemblance to different kinds of either indigenous or non-indigenous, but formulations of roots from earlier periods of migration or indeed colonialism, right? So Michaeline poses a question that I think actually sort of speaks to that sort of, in a sense, that kind of decolonial desire of a sense of, what was here in Nigeria before, in relation to the kinds of distinctions that we might have among Igbo, Fulani, etc., etc. So she says, first of all, Sam, thanks so much for a soldier's point of view, an African or Nigerian soldier's story. Could you give us a general sense of the emerging conflict in the country, say, the impending conflict among the House of Fulani, Igbo, and Yoruba? Was that the tipping point for the coup, this impending fragmentation of the country? I'm thinking of Getachews' idea of world making. There is a military world here that is forged through an idea of order based on a militaristic model, which you have outlined. Were they also influenced by a larger world context besides Fanon, for example? How impactful was the idea of development and modernization?
Great, thank you, Michaeline. That's a great question. The larger ideology of modernization and development was hugely important to them. And when they were called to account for themselves, which wasn't very often, but when somebody managed to do that from outside or occasional improvements within inside, they often justified themselves by saying that what they were doing was modernizing. And there was some truth to that, at least in the kind of infrastructural sense. The other way that they justified what they were doing was by saying that only they were the true nationalists, that only they were the people who could hold the country together, which I think gets at the first part of your question about the constituent parts of the country and the way that it was perpetually and is still perpetually falling apart. And people have been predicting the dissolution of Nigeria since before Nigeria existed, really. And yet it still remains a place on the map. And I think a big part of the answer for why that is has to do with the Nigerian Civil War, which was kind of the crucible in which Nigeria's status as a unified country was forged, strangely. It is the point where it came closest to falling apart that it actually was galvanized into something. But also, the military consistently argued that they were the only people who had enough national consciousness to lead the country in a way that wasn't about ethnicity or class or region or any of these other things. And if there was a homo Nigerianus, they argued, that was a man in uniform, because it was only Nigerian soldiers who had lived throughout the country with connections all over the Federation and who didn't think in the kind of ethnic terms that they argued civilians did and that had been so destructive. Now, it was not really so simple. They too had their own kind of communal, religious, class, ethnic politics that they acted upon. But the way that they justified themselves was by constantly saying that they, unlike the rest of the Nigerian rabble, saw things through national lens. I think
That's really fascinating. And I mean, Sarah's, you've sort of addressed some of the sort of the broad ideas that Sarah's asking you to talk about as well. But I do think, sorry, I do think that there's something quite specific here about questions of the law and understanding of the law. So I'm going to read this. Thanks so much, she says, also for your talk, Sam. I was wondering where else ideas of order might come from, and specifically given that the British targeted ethnicities for military recruitment that they believed to be naturally given to discipline. And these largely came from the north, and Hausa was the official language. And this dominance still existed at that time of independence. And of course, northern Nigeria under colonialism had a very different legal system than those in the south, one based in Islamic law. And of course, Islam has its own view of discipline. So in short, I'm wondering if for some in the military, discipline equals freedom was also in part informed by other sources, religious, cultural, and if some of the tension or dismissal of post-colonial ties into a larger national tensions over what the source of law ought to be was also an issue.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Sarah. It is true that many members of the Nigerian military, or that the Nigerian military continued to have certain regional characteristics even after independence that were very different from this kind of logic of the Nigerian military being the sole truly national entity that I just described. The logic of martial races, as Moses Ochedo and others have described it, which animated colonial recruitment practices in the military, didn't end with independence, and to a lot of Nigerian civilians, the military continued to have a northern character. Now, I would argue that that was truer among the rank and file than it was among the officer class. And the officer class, which is really the group of soldiers who I'm talking about, they were more nationally represented. And in the officer class, there was not a monopoly on positions of power by northern elites, as much as Southerners did sometimes claim that there was. But if you look at the actual composition of the military in this period, it is pretty broad. They did come from a lot of different places. That doesn't answer your question, however. And the notion that the ideology of order that animated this group of people might come from somewhere else besides the barracks, as I alluded to earlier, is a provocative one, and I think there may be something to it. I would not say that there is a link between that ideology of order and the particular legal logic that existed in northern Nigeria, which is to say the patchwork of Islamic and customary legal principles that animated law in places like so and so. I don't think that legal logic is any more or less inclined towards the language of discipline than other legal orders in Nigeria, customary or otherwise. But it's an interesting idea, and I think that there is probably some truth to the notion that discipline wasn't just something that they picked up from their military training.
I mean, I suppose this also sort of goes to the question more generally of how one comes into an understanding of a secular law in a context where there hasn't been that, right? Or at least there has been the kinds of distinctions that Sarah's describing. Like how is secularism distinct depending on where it is, how much is it shaped by what it responds to, etc., etc.
Yeah.
But thanks for that. I think that's fascinating. There's a question from Diane Nelson here also, who does her work mostly, of course, in Guatemala, and she has a kind of a question that's both comparative but also emerges from that side specifically. So And also she starts off with wonderful talk. Sam, thank you so much. You're making me think about an interview I did with a Guatemalan colonel who it turned out had been reading Foucault when he designed the system of model villages and development poles for holding captured refugees after the scorched earth part of the Civil War. He was later demoted for being too soft on the Maya with his ethnically aware Hearts and Minds campaign. Might you address some of those forms of discipline, space, time, the soul, etc. in Nigeria?
Fascinating. Thank you, Diane. I mean, I think a lot about your work and a lot more generally about comparisons to Latin America, which has, in some ways, I think, has a pretty similar experience of military rule in the same era. The notion that a military officer might be reading Foucault and taking something from it about how to carry out his duty does not surprise me, given what I've just been talking about. The form of discipline that was enacted in Nigeria, I should note, however, was, I think, a pretty un-Foucauldian. The Foucauldian structures of power that might have been useful in disciplining the population were by and large not there in Nigeria in the 1960s and beyond. Which is to say, the colonial government had invested very minimally in institutions like schools and asylums, the things that might be used to those Foucauldian ends or purposes. And although the Nigerian First Republic from 1960, after 1960 to 1966, invested very rapidly and heavily in those kinds of institutions, you know, Rome couldn't be built in a day. And so by the time the military took over in 1966, the state was still pretty thin, pretty slim. And so the disciplinary project that soldiers wanted to achieve, which we could imagine in other circumstances might have been achieved through the school and the asylum, all of those things, instead was achieved by men with whips on street corners. And I think that this was not because there was some sort of inherent atavism, like an inherent violence to soldiers. It was because whips were the only thing they had. Building an education system is expensive, a whip is cheap. And so they made the calculus that if they wanted to discipline Nigerian society, which they did, the thing that they had at their disposal was force and also law, and not that larger Foucauldian system. But I suspect that had that system been there, they would have tried to use it for this disciplinary project. But you know, it's speculative. But thank you.
Thank you. Well, are there any more follow-up questions from our audience on Zoom or in the room? No? Well, with that then, I know that you also have a hard stop, Sam, so I want to make sure that, that you get to where you need to get to. Thank you. I want also, Sam, let me just say, I want to thank you enormously for being willing to be our first experimental hybrid presenter for TGI FHI this semester. I want to thank everyone in the audience in the room for coming today, and thank you everyone on Zoom. I know that we had more than 30 people on Zoom listening in. And you know, many sort of appreciative thoughts coming through. So thanks very much, Sam, and we'll close off here.
Thank you all so much.